It's pretty cool that you can use Azure AD to log into Boundary, but it's even cooler that you can control your authorization in Boundary with group membership in Azure. That's what we're going to be talking about today on Terraform Tuesday. Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to Terraform Tuesday Boundary Edition. That's right, we're going to be talking today about HashiCorp Boundary. This is another installment in my series of Boundary-related Terraform deployments. So we're going to be using Terraform to deploy Boundary and also some resources in Azure that we're going to be using to set up OIDC authentication and then managed groups for authorization. So we got two of the three A's out there. The last one's audit. And well, Boundary can audit its own stuff, but that's still something that they're working on. So we're not going to talk about auditing. Maybe that's a topic for a later show. Before we get into what I'm going to show you today, I want to mention two quick things. The first is, if you haven't checked it out yet, I have a Terraform certification guide. If you're looking to get the Terraform Associate certification, this guide will help you study for that exam and get you ready. The link is down in the description. It starts at $15, so not bad at all. And it's through LeanPub. So the money actually goes to me. You're not paying some random publisher for it. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention. The second thing is that HashiConf is coming up in October. I know that seems a long way away, but next thing you know, it's going to be October. So if you haven't registered yet, it's free. It's going to be all online. And I will be presenting with some of the Boundary team about HashiCorp Boundary, which might be why I'm talking about it now a little bit too. So with that out of the way, let's get into the main topic, which is configuring managed groups in Boundary to control authorization. In case you missed my previous video on setting up OIDC for Boundary, I recommend going back to that and watching that video if that's the thing you really want to know about. In that, I show you how to set up Azure AD. You need a service principal and an application in Azure AD. You need to give it the right permissions, and then you configure Boundary to use that service principal to do the authentication of users into Boundary. That's the whole video in a nutshell. So if you want to know more about that, I'll put a card up in the top with a link to that video so you can watch that. We're going to kind of skim over that today and instead talk about the next portion of that, which is authorization. Great, I've been authenticated into Boundary and now I'm able to do nothing because right now all I have is maybe the default role and that's it. And that doesn't give me a whole lot of permissions. So what can I do to get permissions assigned in Boundary once I've logged in using OIDC? Well, if you watched the previous video, you know logging in with OIDC, it dynamically creates an account for you and associates that account with a user. But like I said, that user doesn't have a role assigned to it. Now you could, as each person logs into Boundary, go and find the user that's been associated with their Azure AD account and assign a role to that. That would be complex and time consuming. You could set up some sort of custom claims to maybe do a filter and then automatically assign some roles or assign a group. And that could be something you could do also. Or, this is probably the best of all worlds, you could look at their current group membership in Azure AD and then make a decision on what roles should be assigned based off that group membership. How about that? Wouldn't that be nice? So that is exactly what we're going to be doing today. Now, what are we going to deploy in order to do that? Let's talk about that now. All right, in order to get our whole demonstration set up, we're going to need a few different things. First of all, we're going to need an instance of Boundary. Now, fortunately, if you already have the Boundary bits downloaded, no big deal. All you have to do is run a dev instance of the Boundary server and you're good to go. Now that does require Docker because it spins up a Postgres Docker container to run the database. So just bear that in mind. But as long as you have Docker and the Boundary binary, you're good to go. So we need that. The other thing we need is Terraform, obviously, Terraform Tuesday. We're going to be using some Terraform. And then the last thing we need is an Azure AD account that has sufficient permissions in that tenant to create applications, service principals, and groups. So assuming you have all of those things already in place, you are good to go. What are we actually going to create? Let's start with Microsoft Azure and what we're going to create in there. All right, up in Microsoft Azure, what do we need to create in Azure AD to get this whole ball rolling? Well, if you watch the OIDC video, you kind of already know what we're going to have to create. We need an application, and we need a service principal associated with that application. And that's the information we're going to use to configure Boundary, configure the authentication method in Boundary. It's going to use that service principal to talk to your tenant. And when someone wants to authenticate, it can kind of do that authentication. It can read some information about the directory, and it's a trusted application. So we're going to have to set that up. We're going to have to give that application specific permissions to the directory. In particular, we're going to give it the permissions to read information about users and read information about groups. Otherwise, it'd be hard to get your group membership. So it's going to be able to do those two things as well. Now, because we're going to need a group to test with, we're also going to create a group in Azure AD named Boundary Admins. And we're going to add our current user account, the one we're using to set up all this stuff in Terraform. We're going to add that account to the group in Azure AD, and then we can test the whole process on Boundary. Speaking of Boundary, what do we have to configure down in Boundary? For our Boundary configuration, we have to set up a few things. First, we have to set up that authentication method. The authentication method is going to be of type OIDC, and we have to give it all the information about the application and service principal that we created up in Microsoft Azure. Now, fortunately, we already did that work in a previous video. So I put that in a module knowing I would use that later, and I had to change some things about that module, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but I got to reuse most of the code, so that part was kind of nice. And then in terms of things we have to set up on Boundary, because it's a dev server, we're going to create our own organization on Boundary. We are going to create a managed group. That's the data type or object type we need to create so that it can filter on group membership. And so we're going to associate that managed group with our OIDC authentication method, and it's going to look at the token that you get back. When you authenticate, you get a token. It's called a JWT or a JWT, I've heard it called, which it makes my skin crawl a little bit, but that's okay. And within that, you can ask Azure AD to include group membership. It's limited to 150 groups, so hopefully you don't have that many groups, but you can ask it to include group membership, and it will send the group membership down, and then you can use the managed group object in Boundary to filter on those groups and see, is this person or this user or service principal a member of this group? And then based off of that group membership, you can assign a role to that managed group. So you can say anybody who's part of this managed group now gets this role in Boundary. And you can do that multiple times. You can assign the managed group multiple roles inside Boundary. So if you had more than one organization, or you wanted to do it at the project level, more than one project, you could assign rights there. So that's kind of the things that we need to set up in Boundary to get everything working as well. So now that we have a good understanding of what's going on in Azure AD and what's going on in Boundary, let's go ahead and look at Visual Studio Code and walk through the demo, shall we? All right, we're ready to go through the demo. We're in Visual Studio Code. If you're looking for the files, if you want to follow along, you can always find them on my GitHub. It's Ned1313. The repository is called Terraform Tuesdays. And then just look at the date of this video and you'll see which repository it lines up to. I have them all sorted by date and then a description after that. So we're going to be working in the 2021 0831 Boundary Managed Groups folder. And in there, I've got a Terraform configuration. I've got a module for the Azure OIDC component, and I have a set of commands and a README. If you go through the README, it just kind of explains everything that I already went through. So we're not going to go through that in depth. Let's start by looking at our configuration, and I want to dig into the Azure stuff first, just to bring up a couple points and show you what's changed since the last time we looked at it. So I'll go ahead and expand that one out, and we'll take a look at Azure. Well, actually, let's take a look at Terraform.tf, because there's one important thing that I want to highlight here. The 2.0 version of the Azure AD provider has been released by Microsoft and HashiCorp. And it has breaking changes, people. So if you're using Azure, the Azure AD provider today, and you're on 1. something, make sure that you have that pinned as a version until you're ready to change, because otherwise, if you automatically upgrade to 2. whatever, it's gonna break your stuff. So just want to get that out of the way. Public service announcement. If you go to 2.0, there are breaking changes. Now let's take a look at what's in the Azure AD.tf file. All right. So in here, we have to set a few things. We need to set up the reply URL. This is the URL where after it's done the authentication, Azure AD will send the reply back to. And since we're going to be running the Boundary server as a local dev instance, we can send it back to local hosts since it's all happening locally. So I have that all set up here. And then some of this we've already gone through before, so I'm not going to go deep into it. I do want to point out a few things that have changed. One is the resource Azure AD application. They've added some things in here which are extremely useful. One of them is group membership claims. This is the attribute that tells Azure AD to include group membership. And you can say, I want everything. You can say, I want only like Microsoft 365 Office groups, or I only want security groups, or there's like one other option beyond that. I'm saying all just to be on the cautious side, but if you have a lot more than 150 group memberships for each person, then maybe using security groups only might make more sense for you. You also should really set owners. It's not a required field, but it's optional. In my case, I didn't set owners at first and it broke something. So probably set the owners field. You can just set it to your current object ID using the Azure AD client config data source. Okay, that's pretty cool. The other pretty cool thing that they've added in is this whole required resource access block. And that lets you specify, here's the app ID of the resource I need access to. So in this case, we need access to the Microsoft Graph because version 2.0 of the Azure AD provider uses the Microsoft Graph, and pretty much all future programming should use the Graph instead of the older Azure AD API. So we're targeting the Graph. That's what we want to do. And we want to give our application some access. So we can say we want to give it user read all, user read write. It may not need that, but I threw it in there. You can take it out and test if you're concerned. And then group member read all. So I put those three permissions in there. If you're trying to find these IDs, they should be the same in Azure Global for Microsoft Graph. If you're using one of the government clouds or something, they might be different, and you'll have to use the Azure CLI to figure out what the actual ID is. It's a little tricky, but it can be done. Anyway, so that's what's updated in the Azure AD application block. Whereas before I had to do a lot of funky stuff with querying the Azure Graph as an API and then doing some for loops to extract all this information. Now I can just put it in there. It's kind of nice. Okay. Beyond that, the Azure Service Principal, that hasn't changed significantly, except that I've added in the owners field there because once again, when I didn't add the owners field initially, something broke. So I added it in and that thing didn't break anymore. So that was good. Next thing is the Azure AD Service Principal password resource has also changed. Before you had to supply it a password to use, so you'd use the random password generator, say from Terraform, or you could submit it from Vault or something. In this case, it will generate a password for you and give that back as a value, so you do not need to submit, and in fact, you cannot submit a password of your own to this resource anymore. And then the new thing that's in here is I've added an Azure AD group, and I've set security enabled to true, so it's a security group. And for members, I've added myself, my object ID, from the Azure AD client config. So that looks at what I'm using at the Azure CLI and adds that user into this group. And then I can use the same user to log into Boundary to test that it all works. In a real world scenario, you would obviously populate this with different members of people who you actually want to manage Boundary. So that's everything in the Azure AD configuration. And then I have some outputs here that go to the root module where I'm actually doing the Boundary configuration. So let's take a look at that now. All right, we just took a look at the Azure AD configuration. Now it's time to take a look at the Boundary configuration. And really the only file we need to look at in here is the OIDC auth method file. So I'll go ahead and open that up. We have to define our provider for Boundary and our access information for that. Now, since I'm using the dev instance, I know what that information is going to be. But if you're using a different instance of Boundary, you're going to have to update this provider. and I'm invoking the Azure OIDC module to configure the Azure side of things. And then I can reuse that for future demos. So that's why I made it a module. It actually, it does make sense. Then we create our boundary organization called Organization 1. This is the same as in the OIDC demo. And for the resource, the OIDC resource, that is all the same as well. Nothing there has changed. If we scroll down a little bit more, we get into the two resources that I've added here. The first one is a boundary managed group. This is brand new to the provider for Boundary. And if you look in the documentation on the Terraform registry, this is actually missing right now. But if you go to the GitHub, it's in the docs. I think they just haven't refreshed the docs on the registry side, but it is there if you're looking for the details on this. But basically, I have to give it some information. I have to give it an authentication method. Which authentication method am I linking this managed group to? And I pass it the OIDC Azure AD auth method. I give it a description and a name, no big deal there. And then the filter determines who should be a member of this managed group. What I'm going to do is so the downside, and this bothers me, is the Azure AD group claims will only return the unique ID of each group. It's not going to give you the group name or anything like that. So you have to do it by object ID. Fine. So because we're creating the group ID in the module, we can grab that group ID. So that's what I'm doing the first part of this filter. I'm grabbing the group ID of the group that we just created. And then in the token that we get back from the Azure AD OIDC, there is going to be a section called groups, and that will just be a list of all these groups. Each group will have its own key in there. So I can check to see if that group ID is in token groups. If it is, that means the user is a member of Boundary admins, and I want to assign it a role, which is what we do in the next section. So down in the next section, I have to set the scope. So where is this role scoped to? And I'm scoping it for the organization we just created. What permissions do I want to grant it? So we're doing that with a grant string. In this case, I want to make it pretty much an admin for the entire org. So ID is star, so that's any resource in this scope. Type is any type of object in this scope, and actions is star, so any action in this scope. So this person who gets this role will be able to do pretty much anything within the organization. And then finally, who is a member of this role? In the principal IDs, I can specify the ID of the managed group that I just created. So that's the whole kit and caboodle. That's the whole configuration of Boundary in Azure. Let's go ahead and get Boundary deployed and get our resources created using Terraform. All right, now that we've reviewed our configuration for Azure and Boundary, let's get things started. I'm going to open up the file commands.sh. And these are the instructions that you can walk through with me if you wanted to. Let's go ahead and open up a terminal down below. The first thing we're going to do is start up an instance of Boundary. So we're going to do that by doing boundary dev-host address equals localhost, because I want to make sure it's using localhost for its address, and for API listen address, I want it to use localhost as well and not 127.0.0.1. If you watched the previous OIDC video, you know that was a problem for that reply URL. So that's why that's all in there. Let's go ahead and run that command now. And this is going to take a few seconds to spin up because it has to create that container on Docker, get that running, and then launch Boundary. Now that Boundary is successfully up and running, let's go ahead and open up a second terminal window here. And I'm going to jump back into WSL because that's just my preferred environment for running these commands. And I'll go into the directory for today. There we go. And let's start by authenticating to Boundary. So I'll go ahead and do that now. And the password for Boundary is going to be password. That's the default password when you spin up a dev instance. So there we go. And we're going to set the Boundary token environment variable so it doesn't keep yelling at me that I haven't set the Boundary token. So let me grab the token and I'll just paste it down here. There we go. Okay, I've set my environment variable for Boundary. So I'll be able to now use Boundary commands without constantly getting pestered about the token thing. All right, if you're not already logged into Azure using the CLI, you'll need to do that so you can use Terraform. So log in with Azure, log in with whatever, or select whatever subscription you plan to use, even though we're not really creating resources in a subscription. And then now we're going to create the resources. First, I'm going to run standard Terraform operating procedure. We'll run Terraform init to get the different versions of the providers. And then once that is complete, we'll just go ahead and run Terraform apply auto approve. And fortunately, this doesn't take very long because it's just creating some objects in Azure AD. It's not like it's spinning up a virtual machine or anything. And then it's creating some things in Boundary. So it only has to do those two things. It should go by pretty fast. If it takes too long, I'll skip ahead to when it's done. And it's done. Okay, that was really fast. Now, one of the things you might remember from the previous video is when we ask for those permissions for the application in Azure AD, those are requests. And then an admin is supposed to go into the Azure CLI or the console and actually approve those requests. So the output, one of the outputs from this Terraform configuration is the Azure CLI command to grant those permissions to the app we just created. So just go ahead and copy that grant command and paste it down below, and it'll go ahead and grant all of those permissions. Now that application we created has the permissions like reading users and reading group membership. Okay, so this should all be ready to go. Let's go over to a browser and try it out there. All right, here we are at the browser. We're at localhost port 9200, and we're going to choose the organization 1 scope. That's the scope we created, and the only authentication method available in that scope is Azure AD. So we'll go ahead and click on Authenticate. That's going to redirect me to the Azure AD sign-on page. I'll sign in with my account, and once that authentication is successful, it's going to take me back to the page I was just on, and it's going to show me what I have access to. So let's see what I have access to. Well, there's one user in here. That's me. That's the user that was just created based off of my Azure AD account. There's the account that was created along with its ID. If we go into groups, that's funny. There's no groups. How weird. Well, an interesting thing is that managed groups have not been integrated into the UI yet. So if you go into the UI, you don't see managed groups. In terms of roles, it does show you the role we created, so we can go to that. And if we go to grants, we can see, the grants that we gave for this role. If we go to principals, it's going to be blank because managed groups don't show up in the UI. And then finally, if we go to authentication methods, there's the authentication method that we just created. So if we want to look at our managed groups and confirm everything worked properly, let's go back to the CLI, and I've got a few boundary commands we can run. All right, we're back at the CLI, and we'll start by just listing out the scopes that we have because we need that organization ID. So I'll go ahead and run that command, and it will spit out our organization. This is the ID for the organization. I'm going to copy that and paste it into the scope here. And now we can list out all the authentication methods associated with that scope. So let's do that now. And this is the one authentication method that's associated with that. That's our Azure AD OIDC. Awesome. Let me grab that ID. I'll copy that and paste it into this command. And then this command will get a list of managed groups associated with this authentication method. So I'll go ahead and run that. And we can see there is one managed group here, and it is Boundary Admins. That's exactly what we expect. So our managed group did get created. It just doesn't show up in the UI, at least not yet. That is something that they're definitely working on for a future release. But they're focusing on the API and the CLI first. Now, if we want to get information about that managed group, let's go ahead and paste in the group ID here, and we'll do boundary managed group read. There we go. And we can see there's our filter. So it did replace the variable that we had, or the attribute we had in the Terraform configuration, with the actual application ID. And it's looking for that application ID in tokens groups. Okay, so just kind of remember that application ID. It ends in 5593. That's all you have to remember. And then if we look at the member IDs for this managed group, we can see there's one member ID in there. There's one account associated with this managed group. I wonder who that account belongs to. So let's copy that ID. And in this last command, we're going to run boundary accounts read and read information about this account. So I'll go ahead and do that. And we can see this is the claim token that came back from Azure AD. And if we scroll up here a little bit, we can see all of the information that it returned. And one of the things that it returned as part of the token is a list of groups. And if you remember, the group that we looked at ends in 5593. There it is in the groups list. So the filter worked to associate my Azure AD account with the managed group in Boundary, and then successfully assign permissions for me to navigate around in the UI. In fact, if we go back to the UI, the reason I was able to see everything in this, and if I wanted to, I could do things like create a new user. Well, we'll call him Taco Bill. If we, and I can hit save here. The reason I'm able to do that is because I have full permissions to this organization, which I got through the managed groups. So that's the magic trick. That's how I did it. In today's video, we saw how you can use Azure AD as an OIDC source for Boundary, and how you can also look at the group membership of a user in Azure AD and then associate that user with a role by using the managed group object in Boundary. So that was some pretty cool stuff. I hope you enjoyed it. Two quick things to say at the end. First of all, I want to thank my patrons. Without you, I wouldn't be able to do these videos. So if you are in the fence, if you're thinking about supporting, hey, why not head over to Patreon? The link is down in the description, and you can sign up to be a patron. You get a weekly newsletter, and sometimes you get some other bonuses, as well as your name on a nice card in the video. So that's not bad. The other thing I want to say is just thank you. Thank you to everyone who's been watching these videos. I've been watching the number of subscribers rise, and it's very nice. I really appreciate all of your comments and all of your views. If you haven't subscribed, I would ask that you do so if you want to. I understand that sometimes getting lots of notifications is annoying, so you don't have to hit that bell. You don't have to hit the bell. It's fine. That's going to do it for me for today. As always, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay healthy, stay safe out there. Bye for now. So I got Invisalign today, and I took them out for the video, but I thought, just in case you'll listen to the end, you'd be interested. So that's my retainer case, and I've got them in now. And I, added a little bit of a lisp, but I'm going to have straighter teeth, so that's exciting. All right, bye.